And the big news on that is China making moves that definitely seem like they're preparing for World War III. How you doing, guys? This is Eric from worldwasteland.com. I've made a few videos now about how I do think, unfortunately, at this stage, we're going to see this conflict in Ukraine expand into further involvement of other countries, potentially a World War III type situation. Even though, I had initially said that that would happen with direct NATO involvement. We have direct NATO involvement, depending on how you want to define direct. I consider them openly coming out and saying that they're giving information to the Ukrainians that gets Russian generals killed to be direct involvement. But, we still can escalate from that into literal, NATO troops being in direct combat with Russian troops, which up till this point hasn't happened in a way that's openly acknowledged. I'm sure it's happened with SF units and, certain sort of black ops type stuff, but, there haven't been officially US or NATO boots put on the ground in a way to directly combat Russian units. But we're also seeing, some weird things happen with, Russians advancing through Mariupol, and that finally being admitted that they've taken over that area, and now it being posted again that Zelensky is open to diplomatic solutions, which, to be fair, he's always said that from the start. It's NATO and his handlers, as I would call it, that are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, as I've mentioned before. But they've at least said they're open to a diplomatic solution. But certainly that wouldn't be the case. Even he wouldn't be saying that if they were just curb stomping the Russians and destroying them in every turn like the mainstream media wants you to believe. And there's still some people in the comments that seem to take these things as like a political statement by me, that I think this is what should happen, that I think that this is what I want to happen, whatever. I'm trying to just evaluate the situation to find out what reality is so I can plan for my own decisions and my own future. Trying to make decisions based for your prepping, for your finances, for anything based on what you want the world to be or what you think it should be is a recipe for disaster. I try to determine how reality is as close as possible to actual reality, and then make my decisions based on that. And it's pretty obvious that these certain news sources are just completely making stuff up, so I don't trust them, and it's playing out closer to what I had suspected than to certainly what they've been telling me. So I'm going to keep going with that. But the biggest news and the scariest part is that even though, because I've mentioned before that I think that if Russia were to win, that would probably be the best case scenario if it comes to an overall World War III type situation being avoided. I don't think, obviously it's not the best scenario for the Ukrainians. Them winning would be the best. But, if they were to breach a diplomatic agreement, and just kind of settle into like long-term skirmishes like you see in a lot of other these contested places around the world, that could hopefully help avoid further expansion of this into a true World War III. But unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. And the big news on that is China making moves that definitely seem like they're preparing for World War III. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be preemptive about doing something to expand it. It doesn't mean that they think that's exactly what's going to happen, but it does show that they think it's a possibility, and they're specifically preparing for sanctions being laid against China. And I've mentioned before how I think a lot of this COVID stuff could potentially be a way for them to enact backdoor sanctions on Western countries / hoard resources / prepare for conflicts in that way as well. And then the latest news is, I actually was reading this from voxday.net. He said it's pretty obvious that the Chinese are expecting sanctions to be imposed in the next year or 3. And quote, the article he's quoting is, China's Communist Party will block promotions for senior cadres whose spouse or children hold significant assets abroad, people familiar with the matter said, as Beijing seeks to insulate its top officials from the types of sanctions now being directed at Russia. So yeah, so they're not stupid, for sure. They see what's happening with Russian oligarchs' assets being seized and them being boats being seized and finances being shut down. So they're saying if you're a Communist Party senior and you or your spouse or your children hold significant assets abroad, they're going to block promote. You're not going any higher if you're vulnerable by having a bunch of assets spread out over the world. And if you read the article further, it's from the Wall Street Journal, so it's hardly some like crazy right-wing source. An internal Communist Party directive bars senior officials from owning property abroad or stakes in overseas entity, whether directly or through spouses and children. Now that's a big, what I consider to be a pretty big leap for China specifically, because they've been all about owning assets abroad, buying up tons of real estate specifically in places like Canada, the United States, and I'm sure a lot of those are from Communist Party members, or at least companies that are, of course, controlled by the Communist Party to some extent. Now, I can't read all this Wall Street Journal article because it's behind a paywall, but it says the ban outlined an internal notice could play a role in Chinese leaders' efforts to increase his influence at a decade leadership shuffle. At a twice a decade leadership shuffle, excuse me. So yeah, so any sign, obviously, that China's preparing for sanctions means that they think that this is a possibility. Now, why would there be sanctions by West or NATO against China? You know, obviously they could be planning on making a move on Taiwan. They could be expecting or planning to further involve themselves in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and lots of reasons, but none of them bode well. If they're expecting, at least even as just a possibility of there being sanctions imposed on China, then they think that there's a chance of further involvement and further conflict. So not a good sign. Let me know what you guys think. Not unexpected. And like I said, it doesn't guarantee anything. It's just indicative of their thought process on this, that they see this as a possibility and they're preparing for it. Something that we are not doing a great job of preparing for. What are we doing if China decides to enact sanctions on us? We're fucked, as the kids say.
Proper fucked. Yeah, Tommy.
So let me know what you guys think. If you think that's a possibility, if you think they're actually planning something, or if they're just being prudent and preparing for possibilities, seeing what's happening to Russia, and they don't like that exposure of, you know, their oligarchs and whatnot being able to be shut down like that. Could be it. Hopefully that's all it is. But you never know, and it's certainly not a good sign. So thanks for watching, guys. Talk to you later.